So I'm very happy to have these three guys here today. Rong and Patrick and Jordan, they all live in Singapore now, and they all did stints in the Silicon Valley, some longer than others. So just want to pass it over to them. Maybe tell us, a bit about your career story and what are the turning points that really led you to Singapore?
Right, probably let me give it a start. My name is Rong from GovTech. Right, so I think I should not time machine back too far back, right? So probably just 10 years is just about right. So probably 10 years back, I was working for the former self of GovTech, which is IDA, right? So at that point in time, I was a malware reverse engineer, and there was probably some good learnings that I had over there in terms of building deep capabilities. But overall, as a whole, in terms of the culture at that point in time, wasn't very engineering centric, and therefore actually prompts me to move on to the next company, which is FireEye. So that is a cybersecurity company based in Silicon Valley. And shortly after, I was shifted into Silicon Valley to help them build a team to do malware detection, right? Teams to detect some of the most advanced malware that we've ever seen, right? Right from there. Okay, so from there, actually, at the point, the time that I sort of think about coming back home was pretty struggling because there's huge amount of opportunities in Silicon Valley. So be it whether you want to join other, cybersecurity companies or even internet companies like Google, DT, right? Those are some of the challenges that I face because you have to make a decision whether to come back home or to join other job opportunities in Silicon Valley. But something that actually I asked myself was, do you want to come to join, to stay just because you want to have a label, right, that you are a Googler? I mean, no offense, but I mean, I felt is that you are who you define who you are, right? It's not just because someone label you as them, right? So I think I given some thoughts. I actually have 3 main reasons why I came back at the point in time, right? I think the first thing is I do see potential in Singapore. So not just from the government perspective, it's just more from the ecosystem perspective. There is a lot of shift, right? 10 years back versus now. Right, where there is a lot of focus in developing deep engineering capabilities, and I start to see people who are proud, right, to call themselves engineers, and that's something I feel proud as well, right? So that's one thing, and I mean furthermore, from GovTech's perspective, I mean, I was impressed at that point in time, right? I was never, I never thought that government would actually make a decision that they want to build deep engineering capabilities. That sort of blew my mind off. So I mean that, in a way attracted me to come over to join GovTech, right? That's first point. Then the second point is, throughout my career, I've been doing malware reverse engineering type of work, right? And people hire me because of that skills that I have, right? And I'll see GovTech at the point in time give me a career development opportunity, meaning I'm allowed to do something that's different. So they hire me because of my deep skill sets in cybersecurity, and they believe in me that I could actually try something different and build different capabilities around cybersecurity. So I was asked to come back to help build the RAID team, which is the offensive security team, right? And I think that's pretty encouraging for me to to try, right? And the third thing, of course, I would say is the family, right? So I would say I would want to spend more time with my parents, my in-laws, and of course I wouldn't want my kid to only know them through FaceTime. Right? Yeah, so that helps to build some bond in terms of family relationship. But of course, with that said, I also evaluated other considerations such as education. So those are the 3 main reasons why I choose to come back.
Cool. And Patrick?
Thanks. It's good to be back here. This is a much larger crowd. We had the Tech Forum last year, and I think this is about 3 times the size. So and it's also good to see some of the folks that I met last Tech Forum. So my name is Patrick, Patrick Teo. I grew up in Singapore, and I spent about 27 years in the Bay Area. And about 2 years ago, we made the decision to move back. So if you have questions, I can definitely share with you how we went through this decision journey of moving back. While in the Bay Area, I mean, obviously I studied in a university here in Stanford, and then I was fortunate enough to be part of the internet startup, the first internet startup rise, being part of a startup called Shutterfly, which we took public, and then later on with Amazon and with Facebook. As I mentioned, 2 years ago, I moved back to join a company, Redmart. I think some of you who have families in Singapore probably be aware of that. And the main decision to move back is actually quite simple. It's the opportunity. What I did after Facebook was just look around globally to see what's meaningful to work on and what's impactful to work on. And lo and behold, even in Singapore, there was a role that benefited lots of Singaporeans, and it was really meaningful. And so, that, as well as, obviously I have family, and my wife is Singaporean, so we both have family in Singapore. And so that was, simply the reason to move back. And there were a lot of, questions about what it's like to move back, which I'm happy to share with you a bit later. Right now, I'm happy to be part of Google. I just joined last week to be part of their engineering team. So my role is to help grow the Google Singapore engineering team, and also to help Google build products in the region and also globally. It's part of the initiative which some of you may know. It's called NBU, so helping build products for the next billion users. So I'm also happy to talk more about that as well.
Wonderful. I'm sure we have a lot of questions for Patrick. And now Jordan. So Jordan has actually been in Singapore for the longest time in recent history of all of us, right? So Jordan, how have things changed, and what brought you to Singapore in the first place?
So yes, I did not grow up in Singapore. So I came to Singapore in 2015, but my kind of journey with Singapore actually started in 1994 when I was working for Apple Computer. I was helping to introduce the Power Macintosh. Went to Singapore as part of the team to help do that. That was when we were actually building Macs in Ang Mo Kio, which we don't do anymore. At that point, I made a couple of friendships that have persisted to this day. And those friends have been saying to me for decades, hey, Jordan, come to Singapore. This is a place where a lot can happen. You could have a lot of impact. And that's always been in the back of my mind. In the early 2000s, I started building teams in India when I was at Adobe Systems. And so I would actually basically go and spend a week or two in India with the teams, and I'd bracket those weekends by visiting my friends in Singapore. Come into the about 2010, I continued to do that, and in 2014 I met some NUS students and started mentoring them. And this thing kept going in the back of my head, and I actually reached a point in my career in my personal life where it was possible. In late 2015, I applied for a PEP, Personalized Employment Pass, went to Singapore. I did not have a job at the time, and worked there. I've worked for a couple of companies in Singapore, including working with Sue Ray at Carousel. And last year, I was offered the opportunity to do basically what Patrick is doing, but for a company called Indeed.com. Indeed is the world's largest job search engine. We have over 250 million active job seekers on the platform every month. A lot of people just don't know us, so I just have to help you understand what we're doing. We're solving a lot of the same problems Google solves, but we're organizing all the world's jobs.
Cool. So, we've covered a lot about tech opportunities this morning, right? And I kind of want to ask them a bit more personal questions. So one of the issues that Singaporeans out here, and I've lived out here for 2 years, spoken to a lot of Singaporeans and non-Singaporeans, they always say, has the tech culture really changed, right? Because as Xiaohu mentioned and Rong alluded to, even 5 years ago, there was a lot of outsourcing. Maybe engineers were not really esteemed as a career. Like, can things really change so fast in 5 years? You left ID, you came back to GovTech. Did it change, Has anything surprised you? And especially Jordan, 5 years, how have things really changed? Tell us your honest opinion.
So I think that historically, parents talking to their kids have talked about the big 4 jobs, as I call them: doctor, lawyer, investment banker, civil servant. And those are the jobs that they wanted you to pursue. Those were the jobs that have prestige. I've had interactions with young people and with their parents, and I'm hearing them go, yeah, I want them to do something where they're actually building something, software, engineering. I think that we're seeing a transition from engineering being viewed as being a technician to being a profession and to having that same level of respect. It doesn't hurt that the starting pay for one of my new college grads is higher than that for a starting lawyer in Singapore. But I think really there is a perceptual change happening, and I'm observing that from the outside.
I want to talk a little bit about culture, and I think one of the questions that I had before moving back was, what was it like to work in Singapore? After having worked in Silicon Valley for about 20 years, would it be different? And so that, I probed during the interview process, and it looked the same. But I'm happy to inform everyone that, at least at Red Mart, which is where I spent my first 2 years, the culture is, pretty indistinguishable from Silicon Valley. And as you heard from the previous panel, from Hui Ling and from Xiu Rui, the culture is generally what you would expect from progressive tech companies. It's customer-centric, it's entrepreneurial, and it's collaborative. And this is exactly how we experience and how we build software for our customers at Red Mart. And the tools that you would expect to find, we use Slack, we use Gmail and G Suite. You would find it, I think, one of the positive things for me was the transition was actually non-existent, and you feel pretty comfortable in Singapore as well.
Especially, 5 years away from GovTech, was it, did it really change?
Okay, probably one thing that I wanted to say is that even if you have a greatest pool of talent, without good culture, things still don't work, right? So, one of the reasons why I want to join GovTech is I do see some of the things are broken when I left, which I'm not happy about it. I wouldn't want to be too sore, but instead I want to come back and fix some of the problems, right? I mean, somebody must start somewhere. So the good thing that I see when I first joined GovTech, first and foremost, I do see pockets of changes, which I am very happy about, right? For example, the development of Hive, where we have in-house engineers developing codes and stuff. And of course, for cybersecurity side, at that point in time, it's still pretty much of the old self. So that presents me an opportunity to create changes, right? And I think what some of the things I learned over here is that we have to do things in a more iterative manner, right? Adaptation of agile methodology, right? So I introduce us things like, we have daily stand-ups. We discuss about 3 things every day in a very religious manner, where we talk about what are some of the things that you've done yesterday, what you do today, and what are some of the blockers. And of course, why do we want to talk about it is that we want to set ourselves for success, right? Of course, we do accept failures. Doesn't mean that eventually you'll fail, but or rather, I would say that iteratively, there are certain degree of failures. We want to recover from there, right? And eventually hit the goal where you are successful. So that's the mindset that we had. And I think one other thing is we want to have a shift in the mindset of managers, right? A lot of times people say, I want to rise to the bar to become a manager, a director. But to me, those are just roles. What do those roles mean? It means that they have to be facilitator, the enabler to your engineering team. That's why you need to go through the ritual with them to understand what are some of the blockers, to help them clear the blockers, make things go faster, and eventually hit your eventual goal, right? So I think I'm quite glad we do see progressive changes. But with that said, myself alone is not sufficient. How much one person can do. So therefore, one of the other purposes that we have is that we hope to have more people like-minded to come back, join engineering companies or even government to build up this culture in the ecosystem.
All right, this is my last question before I open it up to all of you. Tell me the one thing that pleasantly surprised you when you moved back, and the one thing that you're still struggling with moving to Singapore, right? So each one thing. You want to start, Patrick?
Sure. As I mentioned earlier, one thing that I was really pleasantly surprised is about the culture. And as echoed by Hui Ling and Suri, it's a very customer-centric culture and very supportive and towards building products, and a very supportive culture towards employees and their growth. So that's been a really pleasant surprise. I think another pleasant surprise is the complexity of running a product, of building products in Southeast Asia is actually very enjoyable. It's complicated because there's so many different countries, and these different countries have people that are different, with different support infrastructure and different levels of economic growth. It's actually really, really interesting to learn more about people and to figure out how best to help them. The opportunity is really, really immense. The one thing that I'm still struggling with is the heat. It is quite warm. So, as the Minister was saying earlier on, air conditioning is something that I rely on heavily.
Great. Rong?
Right. One thing that surprised me is that I start to see changes in Singapore, which is slowly becoming a little bit more like Silicon Valley in terms of be it whether the interns that I see from high school or is it from the university graduates, they have the mindset that they want to do big things, right? Things that you are building to scale with global impact or bigger impact per se, right? That's one thing I'm very happy about because that sees projects potential of a country on how much we can do eventually.
So you see more ambition and creativity now? Because just now that was also talked about.
Definitely. I think in terms of like hunger for success, definitely there's a higher degree of hunger for success. And we should not be thinking that we are too good for improvement. We are always looking forward to improve ourselves, and we need to be more hungry for successes. So that's one thing that I see, which I'm very happy about. For one thing that I don't like that much, I agree with Patrick. Air condition may not be able to solve the problem, or rather I'm looking forward to an invention of air conditioning underwear. Like what Min Vivian said. No, just joking. But it's natural, circumstances that it's very hard to avoid. Definitely every place there's pros and cons. There are things that you might want to give and take eventually from different perspectives.
Jordan?
So for me, I was born in California, I grew up in California. The thing I love about Singapore is we have systems and infrastructure that work. I mean, let's just be honest. You can use the escalators in the MRT because they haven't been shut down because people have in them. And you know what I'm talking about, those of you who live in San Francisco. I can get from my house to my office in 15 minutes. And, I'm the Ang Mo up here. I actually don't mind being outside in the weather in Singapore. The other thing I love is I participate in endurance athletics. So I do a lot of cycling, a lot of running and everything. First off, my times are really good when I go to somewhere where it's cool from Singapore. But I can cycle around our country in a day, which is great. Do an around the island ride. Who can say that about the United States? Oh yeah, I cycled around the United States. So there's a lot I love about our country, and I consider it my country. My intention is to become a citizen. So I'm on that path. I want to be there. I want this to be home. It used to be when I landed at SFO, it was like, oh, I'm home. And now we come into Changi and it's like, I'm home. Nice. Okay. What are the things that I wish we could change? This comes from a very personal point for me. So I have to give you a little history. I didn't learn to read until I was 11. I was dyslexic. I still am dyslexic. I write code a lot slower than a lot of people but then it's really good because I've double checked it. It's challenging. That was challenging for me. Here, let's be honest. If I had been in Singapore as a young person in the 70s, I would have been on ITE. I wouldn't be where I am. We need more on-ramps, as I call them. Right now, we have one on-ramp that you hit at the end of P8, and your life is determined by that. Now, I think we're seeing some things happening. I think there's more acceptance of a, quote, path from poly into university and people coming in that way. I find some of those students are some of the best students. With all due respect to my friends at NUS, SUTD, and NTU. I think we need to have more of that. We also talked earlier about a tolerance of failure. I think that, one of the things you see in Silicon Valley, I can tell you multiple stories of people who, their company went down the tubes on Friday. Over the weekend, they pitched VCs, and they were back in operation on Monday, different company. That would not happen in Singapore. We need to make that happen in Singapore. By tolerance of failure, if we talk about iterative processes, if we talk about experimentation, the empirical method, there will be failure. We cannot expect people to report that every experiment was successful. When we do that, we actually introduce perverse incentives into the system that lead to systemic failures. People need to be able to come and say, it failed, it didn't work, but here's what we learned. So, sorry, soapbox.
That's awesome. That's great. So actually we have time and I want to open this up, and I have roving mics this round, so anyone can raise your hand, stand up, ask a question, and Kelvin and Victor will pass you a mic. So let's go over there to the back.
It's Otto. Hi, I'm Neong. I'm Singaporean looking at Walmart Labs right now. I have a question specific to the panelists. So if we look at what happened in China, recently like DT and a bunch of the other Chinese tech companies have started laying off people. And there's this article published in the Straits Times by a professor in NUS who talked about how the Chinese tech bubble has burst. And he made the assertion that if the tech bubble in Southeast Asia bursts, Singapore will be very badly affected. So I'd like to hear your comments on that. That's one. Second, for Jordan, you lived through the dot-com crisis. So the last time,
He did too.
yeah, the last time the bubble burst, Silicon Valley lost 200,000 jobs. So as with any tech sector, oil and gas, there's boom and there's bust. So I'm curious to hear from you what will happen to Singapore when the tech bubble does eventually burst, and how will people rebuild from the remnants, and what are the potential ramifications? As we think about moving back, these are things that are front and center in our minds. So thank you.
So yes, I did live through the first .com. I also lived through the PC crash that happened before that. Wrote the first line of code I was paid for in 1981. I think a couple of things. One is we live in a world that is very different from the world of 1999, 2000, in that, as Mark Andreessen puts it, software is eating the world. It's, everything is undergirded by software. I believe maybe it was Patrick earlier that I was talking with. We shouldn't be talking about tech companies. We should be talking about companies that are built on top of tech, but they're in different segments. And I think that we're looking at a long-term sustainable advantage. I think that one of the advantages Singapore has is that we are in the middle of 4 hours, 750 million people. Okay. Yes, different countries, different markets and everything, but there is so much unmet need there. Indonesia has, fourth most populous country in the world, and it has more resources in the ground now than the United States did at the beginning of the so-called American century. Mm-hmm. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity there. Yes, there will be ups and downs. You know what? There are going to be ups and downs wherever you are. The dot-com bubble burst here. Guess what? There's also a inflationary spiral going on that's venture capital funded here in Silicon Valley. So it's not going to be one place is immune, one place isn't.
Yeah, I think one thing to remember is, I think as far as Singapore tech is concerned, we are at the very beginning of its growth, and I don't think we are kind of over-invested in tech in Singapore by a long shot, and that's why a bunch of us flew over here to try to encourage you to return to Singapore. So I think I understand that at a macro level there may be readjustments in terms of investment, but definitely in Singapore we're still at the beginning of its growth. The other question you asked was what to do if Singapore finds itself in a bubble after all of you have come back. Okay, and I think the perspective to have, especially these days, is that talent is actually global. There are obviously constraints for people to move around, but talent is global. I mean, many of the companies recruit globally. I would frame one's opportunity and one's career in terms of a global talent pool.
right? Probably I would like to address that question in a different perspective. I think the underlying question is there job stability, right? If we are concerned about bubble, right? One thing that I must say is that regardless whether it's good time, bad time, we need people who are capable, right? Talents. So I think the focus is that rather than worrying about what the global climate would be like, we would like to, focus on doing things that we are highly passionate about so that you can be very good at it, right? And when you're very good at it, you are actually largely immune, right, from those global climate changes. And I totally agree with what Patrick said, right? Singapore is just only a very unique place where we live and work at the same place, right? A lot of people out there in the rest of the world, they move around, right, from provinces to key cities, from states to states, just to work, right? I don't think if you have the right skills that people need, be it good time, bad time, you are still mobile, right? So I think that should help to address some of the questions.
Great. So I'm going to take two questions together, and then we'll direct them at the panel. Any more? I saw a few. Yeah, one here. Any more? Yeah, and one behind there. Oh, Pang Wei. Yes.
So, good afternoon. Yes, I'm Zhi Yong. I'm an engineer at Uber. So I have a question for Karen, although it might be relevant to the whole panel, so in the context of a smart nation. So yeah, earlier there was a presentation on the platform, and the platform is great. But my question is, are these platforms specific to Singapore, and what considerations have been made on developing open standards that might be adopted internationally? I'm thinking that this might stimulate industry based in Singapore to implement and operate and support products based on these standards. So, because tech companies that are in Singapore who develop similar products to WeChat, Alibaba, Google, Facebook, etc., they would inevitably be smaller than those companies. But with industry based on Smart Nation, could our small size be at an advantage? Would it be easier to A/B test features in Singapore and carry these lessons to other places? I'd love to hear comments on this.
Wonderful, thank you. I just want to get Pang Wei's, and then we'll take it together because we only have 7 minutes.
So I have a question for Rong Hua, especially you, because you work in government tech. So I would like to ask you a question about engineering culture in Singapore. The problem is that in Singapore, we have a massive culture of groupthink and conformity. How is that being addressed by engineering leaders in GovTech?
I think that's a very good question. Yeah. So I think first and foremost, driving engineering culture has to be a top-down thing, right? Just now I also mentioned in the other question where we need to focus on building capabilities. Why do I say that is very important? That gives you the confidence to voice your thoughts. You always remember that you are investing your time, be it wherever you are, right? Right now, for my case, I'm investing my time to work for a government, right? And I want to make things right. So with that said, if you have focus on building your capabilities, you will not be fearful in voicing your thoughts. It's just like you want the best idea to surface. Everybody can share their views, share their thoughts. It's okay to be, different, right? But ultimately, as a team-wise, we want to choose the best idea within, then decided on it and work on it. Right, so that's my answer to you in terms of whether or not is there a good thing, right? And the other question, the other thing that I thought which is important is we have to be the trendsetter, right? We have to be a trendsetter that if everybody agrees and something is really very wrong and you're part of the discussion, you don't voice out, I think you're one of them to blame, right? So don't be too fearful to voice out your thoughts. Yeah.
So I just want to address that question quickly and also point you to Mark Lim over here, who was one of the godfathers of some of the platforms that GovTech is building. He can also answer that more in detail. But certainly we do build local first, but we do think global, right? And if you look at interoperability, we're exploring that for payments, for digital identity as well, as a way to facilitate trade and growth in the Southeast Asian region. Now that's not easy because of regulation, but we really want to go there. If you look at some countries like India, some of their platforms are completely open source, right? And also people are building it as it goes. So I think we have some deliberations and considerations about that, different aspects of that, and I would love to talk to you, bring in Mark, bring in all my GovTech leaders to that conversation as well, and hear your ideas. So just quickly on that.
Could I comment on the groupthink thing?
Yes, you can.
So groupthink is not a uniquely Singaporean thing. I've seen it in Silicon Valley. I worked 35 years in Silicon Valley. I've seen people drive right off a cliff, okay? I think that there's clearly cultural reasons why it is. I have to lean, as a leader, I have to lean over backwards to be very clear. This is an idea I have. This is a suggestion I have. But you know what? You need to do that in other settings too. I think we may just be more aware of it and more sensitive to it, which will be a positive for us. And in terms of tech, I think we need to really consider that we need to be in the position in 10, 15 years where we are a net system tech exporter, that we're building systems that are going all over the world. We're doing that at Indeed. We're building stuff, the first product we're building in Indeed is launching first in the United States. Not in Singapore, not in the region, but in the United States. We need to be thinking that way. We need to, Hyolyn said, we need to think, you're thinking too small, you need to think big. We need to be thinking big.
Awesome.
I think,
Go ahead.
Sorry, I think that's the general theme I hope you're getting here, that many of the tech companies in Singapore are actually building tech, not just for Singapore, but actually for the region and for the rest of the world. Just a little plug about Google, because I'm hiring. Yes.
So am I.
Yeah, we have teams in Singapore, and we are building tech, not just for Singapore, obviously, but for the rest of the world. And we have a particular focus on Southeast Asia and APAC, but essentially we're building for the world. So I hope you have a sense that if you do decide to come back to Singapore, it is not to be part of the tech, it's not to build tech for Singapore, no, it's actually to build tech probably for Southeast Asia, and in many cases also for the world. I hope that was a good point, because that was one of the concerns I had when I was thinking of moving back.
Wonderful. So I'm going to close, but I want to put each of them in a spot. So who wants to ask Rong Hua a question, and then Patrick, and then Jordan, right? Okay, so anyone wants to ask Rong Hua a question? Anyone? About GovTech? Yes, please, go ahead.
I lived in China for many years, and I remember when Google withdrew, and it really affected my digital life, let's say. And now we hear about the potential split of the Chinese internet and the Western internet. And we heard earlier Singapore is like a gateway between the East and the West. Do you not think that maybe the biggest opportunity in the world right now for Singapore is to be the gateway between these two internets, or hold the internet together, let's say?
That's a very good question. I would say that each market would actually have its own, uniqueness. For us, we do have the accessibility into two markets because of our, background, be able to have different languages and stuff. But if you were to be a pure bridge, allowing from the Westerners to understand English, Chinese, internet and stuff, I think that's quite difficult, right? But at least in terms of opportunity-wise, I think what we can do is that having Singapore as one of the unique environment that can be tapped on to access both markets, that would probably be more sensible in that sense. Yeah.
Great.
I hope I answer your question.
Thank you. Okay, who has a question for Patrick?
Hi, hello. So we've heard a bunch about product and how Singapore has a lot of product and business opportunities. For example, a lot of the next billion users will be found in Southeast Asia, so you want to start a Google office there. What would you say about those of us who are more interested in the technical opportunities instead of business and product? So say we want to work on the next TensorFlow, the next big table, we want to develop algorithms. Is there a role for us in Singapore?
Great question. Actually, my role is not only to recruit engineers to Google to work on next billion users. My role is actually to recruit engineers to work in Google. And so one of the things I'll be doing is looking at all the other product areas in Google and inviting them to set up teams here. So, and I think everyone, it's quite common, it's quite well known that Singapore has a focus on data science and machine learning. So I'm pretty sure, like in my role, I will be looking out for engineers who would want to pursue that. We actually do have a small team already in Google Singapore that works on machine learning.
Great. And a last question
So come
for
look for
Jordan.
me.
He'll be around all day, and Google has a networking session too. How about Jordan? Who has a question for Jordan? If not, I have one in MicePad. All right. The MicePad question says, what's it like to be a non-Singaporean getting into Singapore? Like, how do you find the immigration issues? A non-Singaporean actually post that on MySpet.
So I believe anybody who's in this room who's not a Singaporean will qualify for a PEP, Personalized Employment Pass, based on your current earnings. It's a great way to go over. It gives you a lot of flexibility. That's how I came over. I have been nothing but welcomed by people in Singapore, whether, let me just compare my experience entering my adopted country, Singapore, versus the country of my birth, the United States. In Singapore, I walk up to a kiosk, I open my passport up, I put it in, it flashes, it opens a thing, I walk in, I put my thumbprint, 15 seconds. The most I've ever waited in immigration in Singapore, and this was when I was still having to fill out the cards, okay, was 10 minutes. Yesterday, came into the United States, 45 minutes. I get to the counter, the ICE person says, oh, welcome back to the US. I said, well, actually, no, I'm visiting. He says, well, where do you live? I say, I live in Singapore. Why would you want to live in Singapore? And starts giving me the third degree about why I'm there, why am I not in the US, and everything. It's night and day. When I got my PEP and had to go for my biometrics, I went in, I'm thinking, dealing with government agencies in California, dealing with the federal US government. So I show up at the MOM office at 7:30 for my 8 a.m. appointment. I'm expecting there's gonna be a queue already. And I'm like, I'm the only person standing there, People show up at like 7:59. We all go in at the same time. I'm seeing the person minutes after I'm in there. This lovely woman processes my paperwork, treating me with the utmost respect the whole time. And then she says, oh, you have to pay a fee. And I went, oh my God, yeah, this is like in the US. I'm gonna pay the fee. I'm gonna be bumped out of the queue. I'm gonna go, I'm gonna pay. I'll be in that line for 45 minutes. Then I'll come back here, I'll wait 45 minutes. Okay, yeah, the day's gone, it's shot. She goes, oh yeah, just go over here to this counter, which is right next door, pay, and just come back to me. Round trip, 2 minutes. My total time at MOM was 30 minutes. This is my entire interaction with respect to my EP and all of that in Singapore. Right now I'm going through my PR application process, waiting for that to process. A little bit more rigorous, a little bit more harder questions because they're deciding they're gonna let me stay permanently in Singapore. And that's, it's reasonable. But again and again, what I find is our civil servants care, they treat people with respect. It is so different from the US. And this is like when I talk with people, they say, oh yeah, I want to go to the US. I was like, really? Why would you subject yourself willingly to this? Okay? And I understand, it's not perfect in Singapore, but there is so much we've got right. So much we've got right. Let's focus on that, and then let's do that iterative improvement to clean up and bring the other things forward.
Awesome. So thank you, Jordan. And thank you also for, we had Ankiti from Zilingo, and she couldn't make it. And thank you so much, Jordan, for attending. And this was completely not prepared.
I got the message from Karen on the plane. Jordan, can you do this panel?
The point is we didn't prepare him. Yeah. All right, so one sentence each. Advice for people considering career in Singapore, one sentence. Let's start with you since we have been going this way.
Go for it.
Regret minimization, I would say. If you don't know what it is, you should look it up. But basically, in life, we make a lot of decisions, and some decisions are really hard. I think one way of making decision is to minimize regret. If you're 80 and you're looking back at your life, ask yourself, would you not have wanted to spend a few years, and maybe more, but would you not have wanted to spend a few years in one of the most dynamic regions right now? And both in terms of customers as well as in terms of tech. So ask yourself that.
Focus on building capabilities within yourself that works for you and your company, right? That give you accessibility to anywhere in the world, right? So Singapore, of course, is one of them. So if one day you think that that's not going to work, you still have an option to go anywhere that you think you want to.
Amen.
Awesome. So thank you guys very much. And please try our Singaporean food over lunch. We'll see you guys back at 2 o'clock for our panels, our deep dives. Thank
Thank you, Patrick, Ronghua, Jordan, and Karen.